On a warm Saturday evening in the summer of 1861, the people of London gathered on the bridges over the Thames to watch the river burn. Not the buildings along it, the river itself. For a quarter of a mile along the south bank, just east of London Bridge, the warehouses that held the wealth of an empire were a wall of flame 100 feet high, and out of them poured rivers of molten tallow and burning oil that spread across the surface of the water and floated there, still alight, drifting on the tide. The glow could be seen from 15 miles away. Crowds came out from every part of the city to stand and watch, because nothing like it had ever been seen, and because at that hour it did not yet feel like a tragedy. It felt like a spectacle. It was not a spectacle. 6 men would die before it was over, and one of them was the most important firefighter in the world. There was no war that evening. There was no earthquake, no lightning strike, no act of God. There was only a set of iron doors that had been left standing open in the ordinary course of a working day, a district built to burn, and a city that had decided, quite deliberately, that putting out fires was a matter for insurance companies rather than for itself. When the flames came, the man who had invented professional firefighting walked into them, as he always did, to hold the line. He did not walk out. His name was James Braidwood, and by the time his body was pulled from the ruins 2 days later, London had begun to understand something it had spent decades refusing to see. The way the greatest city on earth protected itself from fire was a fiction. It worked only until the day it did not, and this was that day. Before we go further, a small thing. This channel is only just getting started, so if these forgotten corners of Victorian Britain are the kind of history you find yourself drawn to, take a moment to subscribe, and a like genuinely helps these stories reach more people. And I would love to know, down in the comments, where in the world you're watching from. To understand what happened at Tooley Street, you first have to understand what Tooley Street was. And to understand that, you have to understand the river it stood on. By the middle of the 19th century, the Thames below London Bridge was the beating commercial heart of the largest empire the world had ever known. Ships came up from every ocean, and what they carried had to be stored somewhere, close to the water, close to the markets, close to the counting houses of the city, just across the river. That somewhere was the South Bank, the stretch of Southwark and Bermondsey that Londoners had come to call London's larder. It was a wall of warehouses, packed shoulder to shoulder, running back from the waterline in dense brick blocks, several stories high, and into them flowed the produce of the whole trading world. Tooley Street ran along behind these wharves, a narrow, busy thoroughfare, shadowed by the great buildings that rose on either side. The wharves themselves had names that meant money to any merchant of the day: Hayes Wharf, Chamberlain's Wharf, and, at the centre of what was to come, Cotton's Wharf. These were bonded warehouses, which meant they held goods on which the import duty had not yet been paid, goods held under lock and Crown supervision until a buyer took them and the tax fell due. They were, in effect, the strong rooms of imperial commerce, and what they held would, in the wrong circumstances, prove to be one of the most dangerous concentrations of fuel ever assembled in one place in an English city. Consider what was inside them. At Cotton's Wharf alone, by contemporary reckoning, there lay something in the order of 5,000 tons of rice, 10,000 barrels of tallow, 1,000 tons of hemp, 1,100 tons of jute, 3,000 tons of sugar, and 18,000 bales of cotton. Read that inventory again and think about what most of it was. Tallow is rendered animal fat, the raw material of candles and soap, and it melts and flows and burns like a fuel because that is very nearly what it is. Hemp and jute are dry, oily plant fibres. Cotton is cotton. Sugar burns. This was not a warehouse district in the modern sense of pallets and forklifts. It was a mountain range of combustible material, stacked floor to ceiling, held behind brick, and there was no legal limit whatsoever on how much of it could be crammed into a single building, or how close those buildings could stand to one another. And they stood very close indeed. The wharves were built wall to wall, with no gaps between them, no open ground, no fire breaks of any kind. A fire that started in one had a continuous, unbroken path into the next, and the next after that. The men who built them had not been careless so much as commercial. Space on the riverside was worth more than almost any space in the world, and every foot left empty for safety was a foot that earned nothing. So nothing was left empty. Into this world came the man at the centre of everything that followed, and to understand why his death mattered so much, you have to understand who he was before it. James Braidwood was born in Edinburgh in the year 1800, the son of a builder and upholsterer. He was, by every account, a serious and methodical young man, and in 1824, at the age of just 24, the city of Edinburgh gave him a task that had never really been done before anywhere in the world. They asked him to organise a fire service, not a collection of parish volunteers with a hand pump, not a scramble of neighbours with buckets, but a trained, disciplined, standing municipal fire brigade, the first of its kind. And Braidwood, more or less from first principles, invented modern firefighting. He worked out that firemen should be young, fit, and drilled like soldiers. He recruited slaters and masons and sailors, men who were used to heights and to ropes and to keeping their heads. He trained them relentlessly, at night, in the dark, in conditions as close to real as he could make them. He studied how buildings burned and how fires spread, and where a fire could be attacked and where it could not. He wrote it all down, and in 1830 he published a book on the construction of fire engines and the training of firemen that became the foundational text of the entire profession. There is a reason that James Braidwood is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as the father of the British fire service. He very nearly was its inventor. In 1833, London came calling. Not the city government, because in the matter of fire, the city government did not really exist. Something else had come looking for him, and what that something was tells you everything about the trap that London had built for itself. There was, in 1833, no public fire brigade in London. There was no fire brigade paid for out of the rates, answerable to any elected body, charged with protecting the lives and homes of Londoners. There was nothing of the kind, and the reason there was nothing of the kind is the quiet, structural fact at the centre of this entire affair. Fighting fire in London was a business. It was run and paid for by the fire insurance companies. The logic of it was old and, on its own narrow terms, almost reasonable. If you insured a building against fire, you had a direct financial interest in that building not burning down, because if it did, you had to pay out. So the insurance companies had, over the previous century, each set up their own little brigades to protect the properties they covered. In the earliest days, this reached an absurdity that tells you exactly what firefighting in England was for. When a fire broke out, the insurers' men would arrive and look for a metal plaque, a fire mark, fixed to the wall of the building, showing which company insured it. If it was one of theirs, they fought the fire. If it was not, in the worst of the old days, they might stand back and let it burn. By 1833, this had at least been rationalised. 10 of the major London insurance offices had agreed to pool their separate brigades into a single combined force, the London Fire Engine Establishment. And it was to run this new establishment that they brought James Braidwood down from Edinburgh. He built it into the finest firefighting force in the country. He gave it discipline, training, and organisation. He commanded it in person at fire after fire for the better part of 30 years, and he did it with a quiet, steady courage that made him a legend among his own men. But notice what the London Fire Engine Establishment was and what it was not. It was funded by insurers, and its purpose, its founding and legal purpose, was to protect insured property. Not the city, not the uninsured, not, as a first duty, human life. It existed to reduce the losses paid out by the companies that funded it, and that is a very different thing from a public service though for many years the difference did not much show. Braidwood himself, a humane and dutiful man, plainly did not fight fires as though only the insured deserved saving, but the money that paid his men came from the ledgers of the insurance offices, and money always, in the end, remembers what it is for. There was a second problem, and it was one Braidwood himself understood better than any man alive. The force he commanded had been sized and shaped for a smaller London, and London had not stopped growing. The establishment was, at its height, still a body of only around 130 men, spread across a scattering of stations, charged with protecting a metropolis of well over 2.5 million people, and a riverside stuffed with the concentrated wealth of the world. It was superbly trained and hopelessly outmatched. Braidwood knew it. He had said so, plainly and more than once, to anyone with the authority to change it. The trouble was that no one had that authority because no one was actually in charge of London's safety from fire. It was everybody's concern and therefore nobody's duty, and that gap, that structural absence of any public authority responsible for the whole, sat under the entire city like a fault line. And Tooley Street, of all places, had shaken along that fault before. The wharves east of London Bridge were not strangers to fire. 25 years earlier, in 1836, a great blaze had torn through Topping's Wharf on that very stretch of the South Bank and done enormous damage. 7 years after that, in 1843, fire came again to the same district, around St. Olave's, and again the warehouses burned and the losses ran high. These were not small events. They were serious, expensive, well-remembered fires, and they had happened in living memory to the exact kind of buildings, holding the exact kind of goods, standing in the exact wall-to-wall arrangement that made up Cotton's Wharf. So the danger was not a surprise. This is the part that ought to sit heaviest. Nobody could stand on Tooley Street in 1861 and claim that no one had known these warehouses could catch. They had caught twice within a generation, and the man who had fought those earlier fires and studied them and drawn the obvious conclusions had gone to considerable lengths to say what needed to be done about it. Braidwood had made extensive recommendations for exactly this range of wharves. He understood, in a way the merchants either did not or preferred not to, that the only defence against fire in a district like this was to stop it moving. If you could not prevent a fire starting somewhere in 11 acres of oil and fibre and sugar, and realistically you could not, then the whole battle came down to containing it, to sealing it inside the compartment or the building where it began, and denying it the path into the next. Everything depended on separation. And here is the bitter centre of the whole affair, the fact that turns a great fire into a preventable one. The warehouses were not defenceless. They had been fitted, at real expense, with the very thing Braidwood's thinking called for. They had iron fire doors, heavy metal doors, set into the internal walls, designed to be closed so that each section of the building became its own sealed compartment, so that a fire in one part could not run into the rest. The safeguard existed. It had been built in. On the day the fire came, the doors that could have stopped it were standing open. They were open for an ordinary, mundane, entirely human reason, and that is what makes it so hard to bear. It was a Saturday, a working day, and goods were moving. Men were carrying and rolling and hauling produce through the building, in and out of the compartments, and a heavy iron fire door is an obstacle to that work. So, in the ordinary routine of trade, the doors were propped open to let the labour flow, as they very likely were on most working days, because closing them slowed everything down, and there was no fire today, just as there had been no fire yesterday. The measure that could have contained the disaster was defeated not by malice, and not by ignorance of its purpose, but by the simple, daily friction of commerce against caution. Convenience won, as it so often had, because the cost of caution was visible and immediate, and the cost of the open door was invisible until the one day it was not. Around those open doors lay the rest of the flaws, and the later inquiry would itemise them one by one. There were no fire breaks, so the buildings offered fire a continuous road. There were floors that had been built and sold as fireproof, and were nothing of the kind, construction marketed with a confidence the materials did not deserve. There was the fuel load itself, the tallow and oil and cotton and hemp in quantities without limit or regulation. And there was water, or rather, the lack of it. The Thames was tidal, and on the evening the fire took hold, the tide was low, so that the greatest natural reservoir in England lay drawn back and out of easy reach at the very moment it was most needed. South London's fire protection was thin at the best of times, and this was not the best of times. Put it all together, and you have a district engineered without anyone ever quite deciding it, to burn to the ground the moment fire got a proper hold, and defended by a private force too small to save it, in the name of an economy that had made warehousing profitable and safety optional. The ignition, when it came, would almost be a detail. What burned Tooley Street was not a spark, it was 30 years of choices. As for the spark itself, the truth is that no one ever established it with certainty, and it would be wrong to pretend otherwise. The fire is believed to have begun in a store of jute or hemp at Cotton's Wharf, and the cause most often put forward is spontaneous combustion, the slow, treacherous self-heating that can occur deep inside a mass of oily fibre until it reaches the point of ignition entirely on its own, with no flame and no carelessness required. Others suggested it might have been a dropped pipe or a careless moment of smoking on the wharf. The plain fact is that it was never proven, and in a sense it hardly matters which it was. In a building packed with self-heating fibre and melting fat, with the fire doors open and the tide out, the question was never really whether it would burn, only when. It burned on the 22nd of June, 1861. The morning of that Saturday was, by every indication, an ordinary one on the wharves. It was midsummer, the days long and warm, the river busy. Along Tooley Street, the great buildings threw their usual shade, and the usual traffic of trade moved through them, carts and porters, and the endless carrying of goods that was the whole purpose of the place. In the counting houses, ledgers were kept, and duties reckoned. On the water, lightermen worked the barges between ship and shore. It was the kind of afternoon that had happened 10,000 times before on that stretch of the South Bank, and would, everyone assumed, happen 10,000 times again. The men working inside Cotton's Wharf moved through its compartments and left the iron doors standing open behind them, as they had the day before, because there was nothing to suggest that this particular Saturday was any different from the rest. Somewhere in the late afternoon, around 4:30 or 5 o'clock, in a store of fibre at Cotton's Wharf, the fire found its beginning, and once it had begun, it moved with a speed that took the breath away, because everything about the building had been arranged, however unintentionally, to help it. Through the open doorways it went, from compartment to compartment, feeding on hemp and jute and cotton, and where Braidwood's iron doors should have stopped it cold, there was nothing but open air and a clear path onward. What might, behind closed doors, have been a serious fire contained to a single section of a single warehouse became, within a very short time, something else entirely. A fire with the whole of Cotton's Wharf open before it, and 11 acres of fuel beyond. The alarm went out, and the London Fire Engine establishment turned out to answer it, and at its head, as he had been at the head of every great fire in London for nearly 30 years, came James Braidwood. He went, as was his unvarying habit, straight to the heart of it. Braidwood did not command his fires from a safe distance. He believed, and had built his entire method upon the belief, that a fire officer had to be among his men, seeing what they saw, sharing the danger they shared, so that his orders were grounded in the reality in front of him, rather than in a report carried back from the front. So he moved along the riverside among his firemen, directing the fight, placing the engines, and doing the small human thing for which those who served under him remembered him ever after. Braidwood was a teetotaler who nonetheless carried a flask of brandy at a fire, not for himself but for his men, and he went among them handing out a nip and a word of encouragement to the exhausted and the frightened, steadying them by his presence as much as by anything he said. That was how his firemen saw him in the last hour of his life, moving among them, handing round the flask, holding the line. By the evening the fight had become something no force on earth could have won. The fire had taken hold across the frontage of the wharves, and the scale of it began to reveal itself to the whole city. For close to a quarter of a mile, the south bank of the Thames stood ablaze, and the flames climbed to a height that eyewitnesses put at 100 feet and more. One of those eyewitnesses was Arthur Munby, a Victorian diarist who came down to the river to see it, and whose words survive as the best first-hand picture of what the watchers saw. For near a quarter of a mile, he wrote, the south bank of the Thames was on fire. Sheets of savage, intolerable flame, 100 feet high. And then something happened that the warehouses had done before, but never on this scale. The tallow, the 10,000 barrels of it and more, began to melt. Rendered fat turns to liquid in heat, and the heat inside those buildings was beyond anything the barrels could withstand, and so the tallow ran. It poured out of the warehouses in burning streams, down through the wharves and into the gutters and over the edge of the quays, and where it reached the river, it did not go out, it floated, it spread across the surface of the Thames in a film of blazing oil that rode the low tide, so that the water itself appeared to be on fire, sheets of flame drifting out from the bank and moving with the current. This is the image that fixed the Tooley Street fire in the memory of everyone who saw it. Not a burning building, which London had seen, a burning river, which it had not. It was about 3 hours into the fight, at somewhere near 7:30 in the evening, that the disaster took the life it is remembered for. The warehouses had become furnaces, and a building burning from the inside does not stay standing forever. The heat weakens it, the structure loses its hold, and at some point, without much warning, the walls begin to go. Braidwood was where he always was, forward among his men, close to the buildings, directing the fight at the point where it was hottest, when one of the great warehouse walls above him bulged and cracked and came down. He was killed instantly. Beside him died a fireman of the establishment named Peter Scott. In the same moment, under the same wall. Say his name, because almost no one ever does. James Braidwood is remembered. There are plaques to him in London and in Edinburgh, and a place in the history of his profession that will not be taken away. Peter Scott is a name that falls out of nearly every account, a fireman who died at his commander's side, doing the same duty for the same city, and who is owed the same remembrance and rarely gets it. 2 men died under that wall. Both of them had answered the same call. Both of them had gone forward when going forward was the job. One of them the world remembers, and one of them it forgot. And there is no good reason for the difference, except that one had a title and one did not. The formal cause was the same for both. They were killed by the collapse of the structure. That is all that needs to be said of it, and all that will be. The fire was so fierce and the ruins so hot that Braidwood's body could not be reached and recovered for about 2 days. His men fought on through that night, and the days that followed, knowing that their commander lay somewhere in the burning wreckage they could not yet reach. And that is its own kind of weight to carry into a fight you are already losing. There was more loss still, out on the water, and it belongs to men whose names were never even written down. As the burning tallow spread across the Thames, some saw in it not a horror, but an opportunity, because tallow was valuable, and here it was, floating free on the tide, there for the taking by anyone with a boat, and the nerve to go out among the flames. Several men put out onto the river to collect it. 4 of them did not come back. Their boat was swamped by the burning oil and overwhelmed, and all 4 were lost on the water. We do not know who they were. The record kept their deaths and lost their names. 4 men drowned amid the floating fire, while the crowds watched from the bridge. And they are the most completely forgotten of all the dead of Tooley Street. 6 lives in all were taken by this fire, 2 beneath the wall and 4 upon the river. The fight itself went on long after the men who had led it were gone. The entire London fire engine establishment was committed to it, every engine and every man it could muster, along with the private brigades and the fire floats working from the river. But everything was against them. The tide was low, so the water they needed most was hardest to reach. The fuel load was without limit and without end. The buildings stood wall to wall with no gap to make a stand in. And the commander, whose judgment had steadied every great London fire for a generation, was dead 3 hours in, leaving the men to fight on without him. The fire burned strongly for something like 10 hours before it could be brought under any kind of control, and even then it was far from out. Deep in the ruins, tallow and cotton and hemp went on smouldering, holding fire in their hearts for close to 2 weeks after the night the sky first lit up over Southwark. For that whole time the ruin was a spectacle, and London came to look at it. In the days after the 22nd of June, crowds continued to gather on London Bridge, and along both banks to watch the smoke rise from the wreckage, and the last of the burning tallow drift on the river. There is something uneasy in that. In the great fire as public entertainment, families coming down to the water to see the sight, while beneath the rubble the search went on for the man who had died trying to stop it. But it is also true to what the event was. It was the largest fire London had seen since the Great Fire of 1666, nearly 2 centuries before, and people came to see it because they would never see anything like it again, and most of them did not yet know the price that had been paid out at the front of it while they watched. The commercial shock arrived at once, and it was severe. The losses were reckoned at around £2 million, an almost unimaginable sum for the time, and the greater part of it fell on the insurance companies, whose payouts alone ran to more than £1 million. 11 acres of the richest warehousing in the world had been reduced to smoking ruin in a single night, along with the goods of hundreds of merchants and the imperial produce those goods represented. The men whose business it was to price the risk of fire in London had just been handed a bill that called the whole basis of their business into question. But before the ledgers, there was the grief, and London expressed it in a way that tells you exactly how the city had come to regard the man it had lost. James Braidwood was buried on the 29th of June, a week after the fire that killed him, and his funeral was not the quiet passing of a public servant. It was one of the great public occasions of the age. The cortege stretched for 1.5 miles through the streets of London. It was accompanied by something like 1,500 police, by firemen from every brigade in the capital and beyond, by the hearse and 15 mourning coaches behind it. Shops closed along the route, church bells were tolled. Crowds lined the streets in their thousands to watch the procession pass on its way to Abney Park Cemetery in Stoke Newington, where he was laid to rest. One newspaper of the day put into words what the sight meant. Seldom, if ever before in London, it wrote, has such a marked tribute of public respect been paid to a private individual. A private individual. That phrase catches the whole strange truth of it. The most important firefighter in the world had died in the service of London, and London buried him like a fallen general. And yet in the eyes of the law and the structure of the city he had served, he was a private individual, an employee of a consortium of insurance offices, because the public service he had spent his life building did not, officially, exist. The city mourned as though it had lost one of its own. It had, but it had never been willing to admit that he was its own, or to pay for the protection he represented out of its own pocket, and that unwillingness was about to be tested to destruction. Because the men who had actually paid for James Braidwood, and for the establishment he commanded, had just done their arithmetic, and they had reached a conclusion that would change the government of London forever. The inquest came first, as it had to, because 6 men were dead, and the law required an accounting of how. A coroner's jury was impanelled and heard evidence on the deaths, and the picture it drew of Braidwood's last minutes was the one that has come down to us. He had been among his men, doing what he always did, handing out brandy and encouragement, steadying them for the fight when the wall came down. That was the testimony. It fixed the manner of his death in the public record, and it fixed, too, the image of the man. Not a commander safe behind the lines, but a leader in the middle of his people, sharing the danger to the last. But an inquest could only speak to how 6 particular men had died on one particular evening. It could not ask the larger question, the one that was now impossible to avoid, which was how the greatest city in the world had come to protect itself so badly that a fire in a warehouse could grow into a £2 million catastrophe that burned for a fortnight. That question was too big for a coroner's court. It went in 1862 to Parliament. A House of Commons inquiry took up the state of London's fire protection in the direct aftermath of Tooley Street, and its findings amounted to a systematic dismantling of the fiction the city had been living under. It found that the supply of water for firefighting was inadequate, drawn from a system never designed for the demand a great fire placed on it. It found that hydraulic pumping capacity, which existed and could have been brought to bear, had not been available where it was needed. It found that the floors and structures sold to merchants as fireproof had been nothing of the sort, a marketing promise the fires themselves had exposed as false. It found that South London, in particular, was poorly protected, thinly covered by a force that had never been large enough for the ground it had to hold. It found that combustible goods were being stored in dangerous concentration, without limit and without separation, in buildings packed together with no fire break between them. And underneath all of these particular failings, it found the single structural fact from which they all descended. An insurance-funded brigade could not adequately protect the metropolis. It had never been designed to. It had been designed to limit the losses of the companies that paid for it. And while a humane and gifted man had run it as though it owed a duty to the whole city, the money behind it owed no such duty, and the law imposed none. The service had been sized and shaped and funded for the interests of insurers, and the interests of insurers were not the same as the safety of 2.5 million people, and Tooley Street was what happened when the gap between those two things finally opened all the way. The inquiry did not, in the end, blame a man. There was no headline prosecution, no individual dragged before a court and made to answer, no villain sent to prison for 6 deaths and £2 million of ruin. The people who might have been blamed were, in a sense, everyone and no one. The wharf operators who packed the buildings with fuel and left the fire doors open in the ordinary run of business. The absence of any public authority charged with fire prevention in the district. The whole insurance brigade model that had made firefighting a commercial service in the first place. You cannot easily jail a business model, so the reckoning, when it came, did not come as a courtroom verdict. It came in a form that was, in its way, far more consequential. It came from the insurers themselves. And this is where an accident became the making of an institution, because the insurance companies looked at Tooley Street and did something that no one had quite expected. They quit. Consider it from their side of the ledger. They had just paid out more than £1 million. In a single night on a fire, they had funded a brigade specifically to prevent. And the inquiry had just announced to the world that the brigade they funded was inadequate to the task. Their first response was the natural response of any business handed a loss of that size. They raised their prices. Fire insurance premiums across London rose sharply in the aftermath, by figures reported at somewhere between 50 and 100%, so that the cost of the fire was passed straight on to every merchant and warehouse keeper in the city. But raising premiums only covered the loss. It did nothing about the underlying exposure, and the underlying exposure was terrifying, because if Tooley Street could happen once, it could happen again, and the companies had just been told in public that they could not stop it. So they made a decision that changed the constitution of London. The insurance companies formally notified the government that they would no longer run and fund the fire brigade for the metropolis. They were done. They had been carrying at their own expense and for their own commercial reasons the fire protection of the entire capital, and they had concluded that it was a burden they could no longer bear and a risk they were no longer willing to underwrite. They handed the problem back to the state, and that is the moment the whole edifice of the old system finally broke, not on the night of the fire, but in the counting houses afterwards, when the men who had been quietly paying for London's safety announced that they would pay no longer. For decades the city had been able to avoid the question of who was truly responsible for protecting it from fire, because the insurers had been willing to answer it, imperfectly, and for their own reasons. Now the insurers had withdrawn the answer, and the question lay in the open where it could not be dodged. If the insurance companies would not protect London from fire, then either no one would, or the public itself would have to. There was no third option left. Parliament chose the public, and the instrument by which it did so was the reform that all of it had been building towards. The law that turned a private commercial service into a public duty and created, in the process, the institution Londoners still depend upon today. The Metropolitan Fire Brigade Act was passed in 1865. Its effect was simple to state and revolutionary in substance. It took responsibility for fighting fire in London out of the hands of the insurance companies and placed it in the hands of a public authority, the Metropolitan Board of Works, the nearest thing London of that day had to a citywide government. From the 1st of January 1866, the stations, the engines, the escapes, the plant, all the apparatus of the old insurance-funded establishment were vested in the public board, and a new force was brought into being under public control and public funding, the Metropolitan Fire Brigade. It was answerable not to a consortium of insurers protecting their policies, but to a public body charged with protecting the city, and it was paid for out of the public purse because protecting the city had at last been recognised as a public thing. That force is the direct ancestor of the London Fire Brigade of today. The line runs unbroken from the brigade created in 1866 to the brigade that turns out across the capital now, and its foundation is Tooley Street. The first chief officer of the new public brigade was a man named Eyre Massey Shaw, who had succeeded Braidwood at the old establishment and now carried the work across the divide from private service into public duty. The institutional line runs cleanly through him, from Braidwood, who invented professional firefighting and died commanding a brigade owned by insurers, to Shaw, who led the first professional brigade owned by the public, to the service that guards London still. One man built the method. His death forced the change. The next man carried it into the new world the change had made. The change in who fought the fires was the largest reform, but it was not the only one, because Tooley Street had exposed the buildings as much as the brigade, and the law reached for them too. The disaster had shown, in the most expensive possible way, what happened when combustible goods were stored without limit in buildings, without separation, and the response was to begin regulating exactly that. New requirements followed for the safer storage of combustible and flammable materials, so that the concentrations of tallow and oil and fibre that had made the wharves a mountain of fuel could no longer simply be piled up without regard for the danger. There were moves to restrict the building of attached warehouses without proper separation between them, to break the continuous path that had let fire run unchecked from one block to the next. And the principle that Braidwood had understood and the merchants had defeated, that a fire must be sealed inside the compartment where it starts, began to pass from one man's professional judgment into the ordinary requirements of building law. The iron fire door, which had stood open on the day it was needed, was on its way to becoming something a building was required to have, and required to keep shut. The idea of compartmentation, of dividing a building into sealed sections so that fire cannot travel freely through it, is written into modern fire codes now as a matter of course, and it is, at bottom, the lesson of the open doors at Cotton's Wharf, learned at a cost of 6 lives and £2 million. It is worth being precise about what changed, because the change is easy to state and easy to underestimate. Before Tooley Street, if your house caught fire in London, whether anyone with an engine came to fight it, and how hard they fought, was tangled up with the question of whether the building was insured and by whom, because the men with the engines were paid by insurers to protect insured property. After the reforms that this fire forced, that question fell away. A public brigade, funded by the public and answerable to the public, turns out to a fire because it is a fire, because there are people and property in danger, and not because a policy is in force behind the walls. The fire mark on the wall, the little metal plaque that had once told the fireman whether a building was worth saving, became a relic, a curiosity of an older and colder arrangement. Fire protection had been a commercial service owed to policyholders. It became a public duty owed to people. That is the whole distance the 19th century travelled on this question, and Tooley Street is the hinge it turned on. You live on the far side of that hinge, and mostly you never think about it, which is the surest sign of how completely the reform succeeded. When a fire engine passes you in the street today, its lights going, on its way to someone's emergency, no one in that vehicle is going to arrive and ask first whether the burning building was insured, or which company holds the policy, or who is going to settle the bill before the water is turned on. They will simply fight the fire, because that is what a public fire brigade does, because fire protection in this country is a duty owed to human beings as a matter of right and not a service sold to those who have paid for cover. That principle feels so obvious now that it's hard to imagine it was ever otherwise. It was otherwise. It was otherwise within living memory of people's great-grandparents, and it stopped being otherwise because a fire on the south bank of the Thames burned so large and so long that the private arrangement collapsed under its own weight, and the state was forced to take the duty up. There is a particular justice in the shape of it that should not be passed over quickly. The man whose death made the case for a public fire service unanswerable was the same man who had spent his whole life proving that firefighting could be a disciplined, professional, honourable calling rather than a scramble of insurers' men chasing fire marks. James Braidwood had built the method. He had trained the men. He had written the book. And he had commanded for nearly 30 years a force that embodied everything he believed about how fire should be fought, held back only by the one thing he could not change from inside it, which was who owned it and what it was ultimately for. When he died beneath that wall, he did not only leave behind a grieving city and a legend. He left behind an argument that could no longer be waved away. The argument that a service this important, this dangerous, and this essential to the life of the city could not be left to the accounting of private companies. His death was the proof of his life's thesis, paid in the hardest coin there is. Today, the wharves he died among are gone. The stretch of the south bank east of London Bridge, where the tallow burned and the river caught fire, has been remade beyond recognition. The bonded warehouses of London's larder were cleared away as the port declined and the city turned to other work, and in their place stands the modern riverside, the glass and stone of London Bridge City, the shops and offices and walkways that carry the crowds along the Thames path where the fire floats once worked the flames. Hayes Wharf survives as a name attached to Hayes Galleria, a covered arcade of cafes and shops, a pleasant place to pass an afternoon, and almost no one walking through it knows that they're standing on the ground where the London Fire Brigade was, in a sense, born, in fire and in loss. More than a century and a half ago, the larder is gone. The river no longer smells of tallow and spice. The danger that shaped the place has been engineered out of existence by the very reforms the place gave rise to, which is perhaps the deepest kind of forgetting there is. The forgetting that comes when a lesson has been so thoroughly learned that the wound which taught it no longer even aches. There are markers for those who look. A commemorative plaque near the site records the Great Fire of Tooley Street and the death of James Braidwood. A small statement in metal on the ground where so much was lost and so much was changed. In Edinburgh, the city that first gave him the task of inventing a fire service, Braidwood is remembered too. Honoured as the founder of the profession, he did so much to create, his name carried by the city of his birth as well as the city of his death. He lies in Abney Park Cemetery in Stoke Newington, where the mile-and-a-half cortege carried him in the summer of 1861, and the London Fire Brigade and the museums of the fire service have never forgotten him. Within the world of firefighting, he is not a forgotten man at all. He is a founding one, and his death at Tooley Street is treated rightly as a founding sacrifice, the moment the modern service was brought into being. But step outside that world, out onto the ordinary streets and among the ordinary crowds who pass the site every day, and the memory thins to almost nothing. The public that Braidwood died to protect, and whose fire service his death created, mostly does not know his name. It does not know that London's river once burned. It does not know that fighting fire was ever a private business, or that the change to a public one was written in 6 deaths on a June evening in 1861. And of the 6, the public memory is thinnest of all, where it ought to be tended most carefully. On the fireman Peter Scott, who died under the same wall as his commander, and is remembered by almost no one, and on the 4 men lost on the burning river, whose names were never even recorded. 4 lives ended in the collecting of floating tallow, gone so completely that we cannot so much as say who they were. That imbalance in who is remembered is not a small thing, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something true about how disasters are recorded. The men we remember are the men who had names to begin with, names attached to rank and record and reputation, names that a newspaper knew how to spell, and a monument could be inscribed with. Braidwood was such a man, and the remembering of him is right and good. But the same fire killed a fireman whose life beyond his name and his trade the record barely troubled to keep, and 4 labouring men whose names it did not keep at all, and the fire made no distinction between them in the dying. The wall did not fall more gently on the famous man than on the fireman beside him. The burning river did not spare the 4 on the water, because history would forget them. They were all 6 of them equally dead, and they are remembered in wildly unequal measure. And the reason for the difference has nothing to do with the worth of the lives, and everything to do with the accidents of who kept the record and what they thought was worth writing down. The 4 on the river are the hardest to hold on to, precisely because there is so little to hold. They were not firemen under orders. They were not sent out onto the Thames by any authority. They went most likely because tallow was money, and here was money loose upon the water, and a man who worked with his hands along that riverside did not let money float past him if he had a boat and the courage to reach it. That is not recklessness, so much as it is the ordinary calculation of people for whom a windfall was rare and a loss was always close. They rowed out into a river that was on fire to gather a floating fortune, and the fire took them for it, and the world moved on so completely that not one of their names survived the week. When you think of the burning river of Tooley Street, the image that draws the crowd and fills the eye, remember that it was not only a spectacle, it was the thing that killed 4 men whose families would have known exactly who they were and grieved them by name, in homes along that same south bank, even as the rest of London came down to watch the water burn. And Peter Scott stands between the 2 kinds of forgetting, a name we have and a life we do not, a fireman of the establishment who had trained under the finest fire officer of the age, and who died at his side in the same instant, doing the same duty for the same city that would build its whole future fire service on the meaning of their deaths. He was not a bystander drawn by the promise of tallow. He was a professional who went forward because going forward was the work, because Braidwood had built a service in which the officer and the men shared the danger together, and on the 22nd of June, that principle cost the officer and one of his men their lives in the same breath. That the city remembered the one and forgot the other is no reflection on the courage of either. It is only a reminder that the record is a careless keeper of the ordinary, and that the ordinary is where most of the dead of most disasters have always come from. There is one more thing about that evening that deserves to be held clearly, and it is the strange, doubled nature of what the crowds on London Bridge were actually looking at. They had come to see the largest fire in London since the Great Fire of 1666, a sight of genuine and terrible grandeur. The South Bank a quarter-mile wall of flame, the river carrying sheets of fire out on the tide, the glow reaching travellers 15 miles from the city who stopped and wondered what could possibly be burning. It was, without any doubt, one of the great sights of the Victorian age, and the people who saw it never forgot it. But everything that made it magnificent to watch was also everything that made it a catastrophe. The height of the flames was the measure of the fuel that should never have been stored so densely. The burning river was the tallow that should have been divided and contained. The sheer scale that drew the crowds was the direct visible proof of the failure that had produced it. The failure of a city to protect itself, written 100 feet high in fire against the summer sky. The spectacle and the disaster were the same object seen from two distances, one from the bridge and one from the front line where Braidwood stood, and only the men at the front line could see that the beautiful, appalling thing the city had come to admire was also the thing that was killing them. It is worth staying at that front line a moment longer, because the men who stood there were not looking at a wonder at all. What the crowd on the bridge saw as a vast and distant glory, the firemen of the establishment felt as heat on the skin and grit in the eyes, and the particular exhaustion that comes of hauling and pumping and dragging hose for hour after hour with no ground gained. They were close enough to hear the buildings working, the deep sounds a great fire makes as timbers give, and floors come down, and the contents of a warehouse settle and shift in the heat. They were close enough to feel the radiant warmth of a wall of flame, 100 feet high, a warmth that at a certain distance stops being warmth and becomes a thing you have to turn your face from and cannot stand against for long. They worked in a light that was not daylight and not darkness, the orange, shifting, sourceless glare of a fire that had swallowed the ordinary evening, and they worked knowing, as the crowd did not, how little any of it was achieving. For that is the part the distance hid. From London Bridge the scene had the completeness of a picture, a thing framed and finished and set apart, something to be looked at. From the wharf it was unfinished and unwinnable, a fight in which every choice was between bad and worse, where to save one range of buildings meant giving up another, where the water that came up from the low tide arrived without the pressure to reach the height the flames had climbed to, where a man could pour everything he had into a position for an hour and watch the fire take it anyway and move on. The spectators went home when they had seen enough. The firemen could not go home because the fire was still there in the morning and still there the morning after that, and somewhere in the heart of it lay their commander, and the work of a fire like this does not end when the flames come down. It goes on into the long, filthy, dangerous business of the ruin, the smouldering heaps that could flare again without warning, the walls left standing that were no longer safe to stand near, the slow, grim search through wreckage, too hot to touch, and it was into exactly that kind of wreckage that the men had to go to bring Braidwood out, in the days after the wall came down, when the ruins were still holding their heat, and the fires deep in the tallow had not gone out. That is a thing the crowds never saw, and the pictures never showed, the aftermath that has no grandeur in it at all, only the patient, exhausting, sorrowful labour of men recovering one of their own from the place that had killed him, in a ruin that was still, in its depths, alight. The spectacle belonged to the evening and to the bridge. The reality belonged to the days that followed, and to the men who stayed when the crowds had gone, and it looked nothing like the picture that had drawn all of London to the water. Think of what 2 weeks of smouldering actually means, because it is easy to say and hard to picture. A fire does not always announce itself with flame. In a mass of packed tallow and baled cotton and stacked fibre, the fire can go inward, down into the heart of the heap, where there is fuel enough to burn for days and where water poured on the surface never reaches. So for close to a fortnight after the night the sky lit up, the ruins of Cotton's Wharf and the wharves around it were not a cold, dead thing waiting to be cleared. They were warm. They steamed and smoked and gave off heat, and here and there, without warning, a pocket of trapped fire would find air and flare up again, and the men would have to turn back to it once more. The tallow that had run into the gutters and the river had cooled and set into a greasy crust over everything, and beneath the crust, the deep heaps went on cooking. It was the kind of fire that does not so much get put out as get slowly, grudgingly, exhausted, starved of the last of what it had to burn, until at last there was nothing left in the heart of the ruin to keep it going. And all through that fortnight, the district itself was a wound in the working life of the port. This had been one of the busiest quarter miles of waterfront on earth, and now a great bite of it simply did not function. The merchants whose goods had gone up in the night had nothing to sell and nowhere to store what came next. The porters and lightermen and labourers, whose daily work was the carrying and lifting and moving of those goods, found the ground they worked on turned to smoking rubble. The barges that would have tied up at the wharves had no wharves to tie to. A fire of this size did not end its damage with the flames or even with the losses on the insurers' ledgers. It reached out into thousands of ordinary working lives that depended directly and indirectly on those buildings doing the plain, unglamorous job of holding goods safely until they were wanted, and for a time that job simply could not be done on that stretch of the South Bank at all. When the ruins at last cooled enough to be cleared, the work of rebuilding began, and it is worth noticing that the wharves did rise again. Trade of that value does not simply abandon the best placed waterfront in the world because it has burned. It clears the wreckage and builds anew because the river was still the river, and the markets across it were still the markets, and goods still had to be landed and held and sold. But the district that came back was not, in every respect, the district that had gone. The very disaster that had levelled it had also, through the inquiry and the arguments that followed, begun to change the rules under which such buildings could be put up and filled, so that the rebuilding happened in the early light of a new understanding of what these warehouses were, and how dangerous their contents could be. The lesson had been paid for on that ground, and the ground itself was among the first to feel the lesson applied. There is a hard economy in that which is worth stating plainly. It took the destruction of 11 acres of the richest storage in the empire, and losses of around £2 million and 6 lives to move the question of London's fire safety from something everyone agreed was somebody else's problem to something the state finally took into its own hands. Nothing smaller had done it. The two great warnings of the earlier fires in 1836 and 1843 had not done it. Braidwood's own patient, repeated warnings across nearly 30 years had not done it. The plain, obvious fact that a private force of a few dozen engines could never hope to defend a metropolis of millions had not done it. It took a fire so enormous, so costly, and so public that the men who had been carrying the burden, for their own reasons, finally set it down and walked away. And only then, with the burden lying in the open where no one could pretend not to see it, did the change everyone had known was needed for a generation actually come. That is often how these reforms arrive. Not when the argument is won because the argument had been won long before, but when the cost of ignoring it grows too large, too visible, and too expensive to carry for one more year. Consider, too, what the men of that time actually had to fight a fire of this magnitude, because it puts the scale of the defeat into its proper proportion. The firefighting of 1861 was a matter of muscle as much as machinery. The engines were, in large part, manual, worked by gangs of men heaving on long handles to drive the pumps, so that the very act of throwing water onto a fire was itself brutal, tiring labour that could not be sustained by any one team for long, and men had to be rotated on and off the pump handles through the night. The newer steam fire engines were only just coming into use, and against a fire the size of the whole South Bank they were pitifully few. On the water there were the fire floats, vessels that could pump the river itself up onto the flames, and these were among the most useful weapons the establishment had for a riverside blaze. Yet even they depended on being able to draw and throw water in quantities that a fire consuming 11 acres of oil and fibre simply overwhelmed. Set the tools of the day against the fuel of that district, and you begin to understand that the men were not defeated because they were unskilled or unwilling. They were defeated because no fire service then in existence, however brave, however well drilled, could have put out what the choices of 30 years had built. That is the measure the new brigade inherited, and it is why the reform was about far more than changing whose name was on the pay ledger. A public brigade, funded from the public purse, could be given something a consortium of cost-conscious insurers would always be reluctant to buy in full, which was enough men, enough stations, enough engines, and steadily better ones, to defend a city that had outgrown everything the old arrangement could afford it. The transfer of 1866 did not by itself conjure a modern fire service into being overnight, and the men who turned out under the new public colours were in the main the same trained firemen who had turned out under the old, carrying forward the discipline and the method that Braidwood had drilled into the service across 3 decades. But the thing had changed at its root. For the first time, the size and the strength of London's defence against fire could be set by what the city needed, rather than by what its insurers were willing to spend. And over the years that followed, the difference told in more stations, in better engines, in a force that could at last begin to grow toward the true size of the metropolis it was charged with guarding. And something else was carried forward that no Act of Parliament could have written into law, which was the character Braidwood had stamped upon the service in his 30 years of command. He had built a fire brigade on the idea that firefighting was a skilled and honourable trade, that its men should be trained and disciplined and steady under danger, and that an officer earned the right to command by sharing the risk he asked others to run. That idea did not die under the wall with him. It passed into the men he had trained, and through them into the public brigade they served in afterwards, and it became part of the deep culture of British firefighting. The expectation that the men who fight fire are professionals in a dangerous calling, and that their officers lead from the front. When we picture a fire crew today as disciplined, trained, courageous people who go towards the danger the rest of us flee, we are picturing something that was not inevitable, something that had to be invented and instilled by somebody. And a very great deal of it was invented and instilled by the Edinburgh builder's son, who died on the Suffolk waterfront on a summer evening in 1861. It is a strange kind of immortality, to be forgotten by name, and yet to have your beliefs become so ordinary, so taken for granted, that no one thinks to ask where they came from. Braidwood wanted firemen trained. They are trained everywhere, as a matter of course. He wanted them fit and disciplined. They are. He wanted fires fought by method rather than by luck and muscle alone. They are. He wanted, above all, a service equal to the danger it faced. And though he never lived to see it, the danger that killed him became the reason the city finally built one. The man is gone and mostly forgotten. The mind behind the modern fire service is his, working still, every hour of every day, in 1,000 quiet decisions made by people who have never heard his name. And it is worth holding for a moment on how unbroken that line really is, because it is the kind of continuity that is easy to state and hard to feel. There was no clean break, no year in which the old world ended and a wholly new one began. The men walked from one service into the next. The engines were the same engines at first, wheeled out of the same station doors. The knowledge, the drills, the hard-won understanding of how a fire behaves and how it is beaten, all of it simply carried on, handed from the firemen who had served under Braidwood to those who came after them, and from them to the next, and on down the generations to the crews who serve the city now. If you could stand the whole succession in a line, from the establishment of 1833 to the brigade of the present day, you would not find the join. There is no seam where the private service stops and the public one starts, only a change in who owned it and who paid for it, and what it was finally for, threaded through a continuity of men and method and courage that never actually snapped. That is what makes the reform so easy to overlook and so profound underneath. The thing that changed was invisible. The engines looked the same. The men looked the same. The fires, when they came, were fought in much the same way by much the same people. What changed was the answer to a single question, the question of who the service belonged to and whom it was bound to protect. And that question, invisible as it is the whole difference between a city that will send help to any burning building and a city that will send help only to the insured. You cannot see it in a photograph of an engine or a fireman. You can only see it in the moment a fire breaks out in the poorest house on the meanest street, with no policy on it and no company's mark upon its wall, and the engines come anyway, at speed, because it is a fire and there are lives in it, and no one so much as pauses to ask whether saving it will pay. You can still find those old fire marks today, as it happens, prized off long demolished walls and kept as curiosities, little cast plaques bearing the emblem of a company, and sometimes a policy number, the sun or the phoenix or a clasped pair of hands. Once they were a matter of life and property, the sign that told a brigade whether a building was its concern, and now they are ornaments, hung on the walls of people who collect such things, admired for their design and their age, entirely drained of the cold meaning they once carried. There is no better small emblem of how completely the old world passed away. A thing that once decided whether your home would be fought for or left to burn is now a pretty antique, and the fact that it means nothing to us, that we can hang it up and find it charming, is itself the measure of how far we have come from the arrangement it belonged to. We are safe enough from that particular fear that we can decorate with its relics, and that safety, the plain and unremarkable safety of knowing that help will come if your house catches fire, is the true monument to what happened at Tooley Street. Far more than any plaque of stone or metal, it is a monument you cannot see, because it consists of a danger that no longer hangs over you, a fear your ancestors carried that you have been spared, a question that was once desperately open and is now so firmly closed that you never even think to ask it. The best memorials are sometimes like that. Not statues, not inscriptions, but absences. The absence of a peril that was once real, quietly guaranteed by an institution so woven into ordinary life that we notice it only in the moment we need it, and then forget it again the moment the need has passed. It is worth remembering, though, that an absence bought at a price is still bought, and someone still paid. The peril that no longer hangs over you did once hang over people exactly like you, and the reason it was lifted is not that the world grew gentler on its own, but that a particular fire on a particular evening cost enough and killed enough and burned brightly enough to force a change that decades of quiet argument had failed to force. The safety you do not think about rests on a foundation of things that did happen and people who did die, and the fact that you can be unaware of them is in one sense the whole point of the reform, and in another sense a small injustice to the men who made it necessary. They are the more forgotten for having succeeded so well. Had the reform failed, had London gone on burning for want of a public brigade, we would remember Tooley Street as a scandal and repeat its name as a warning. Because it succeeded, because it worked, we are free to forget it entirely, and mostly we have. So the safety is real, and the forgetting is real, and both of them trace back to the same summer evening on the same stretch of water. Every ordinary day on which no one in London has to wonder whether the fire brigade will come is a day built on that evening, whether anyone knows it or not. The not knowing is a kind of luxury, the luxury of living so far downstream of a solved problem that the problem itself has become invisible. And it is a luxury that 6 men, 2 beneath a wall and 4 upon the burning river, helped without ever choosing to buy for everyone who has lived in the city since. And so each year, the 22nd of June comes round again, and for almost everyone in the city, it is simply a day in midsummer, like any other, a long light evening on the river, with nothing to mark it out. The crowds that gather now on London Bridge and along the South Bank gather for the ordinary reasons: the view, the walk, the end of the working day, and they look out over a Thames that carries pleasure boats and reflects the glass towers, a river that has not smelled of burning tallow or carried sheets of fire on its tide for 160 years. They stand, many of them, more or less on the ground where it happened, and the water they look at is the same water that once ran with flame, and there is nothing at all to tell them so. Within the fire service the date is remembered, quietly, as the day the modern brigade was in a sense conceived, and the name of Braidwood is spoken with the respect it has always been given among firefighters. But out on the bridge, among the people whose safety was the whole prize of it, the anniversary passes unnoticed, year upon year, as unremarkable as the safety itself. There is a fittingness in that, uncomfortable as it is. The men who died were, most of them, ordinary working people, and the great gift their deaths helped to buy was an ordinary, everyday kind of security, the sort that asks nothing of you and expects no gratitude, and simply waits, quietly, in a station somewhere near you, for the moment it is needed. It is not the kind of thing that lends itself to remembrance. It is too woven into the plain fabric of the day. And perhaps the truest tribute the city pays without ever meaning to is exactly that unthinking confidence, the way a Londoner can lie down to sleep in a crowded street of old buildings and never once consider the fire that could take them, because somewhere the engines are ready and will come if called. No questions asked, no policy demanded, no mark looked for on the wall. That confidence has a shape if you look for it, and the shape is a station, plain and low and often unremarkable, tucked into a street corner in every district of the city. Behind its doors sit the engines, fueled and checked and ready, the hoses coiled, the equipment stowed in its place, and near them sit the men and women whose working lives are spent waiting for a bell that may ring in the next minute, or not for hours, and who must go from stillness to full speed in the space of seconds when it does. It is a peculiar kind of work, most of it spent in readiness rather than action, the whole apparatus held permanently poised for an emergency that, for any given street on any given night, will probably not come, precisely so that it is there on the rare and terrible occasions when it does. That readiness costs money, every hour of every day, whether there is a fire or not, and it is paid for out of the public purse without anyone being asked, individually, whether they wish to buy it, because it has been decided, once and settled since, that this is a thing a city provides, for all of its people, as a matter of course. None of that existed in the form we know it before the reckoning at Tooley Street. There were engines and there were brave men, but there was no settled public promise standing behind them, no principle that the readiness belonged to everyone by right. That promise is the real inheritance, more than the engines or the stations or even the brigade itself, which are only its instruments. The promise is the thing, the quiet, standing, unconditional undertaking that the city will not leave its people to burn. And it was made, in the end, not in a fit of generosity, but under the pressure of a fire too large to ignore, and a withdrawal too complete to answer any other way. And a promise like that, once made, has a way of outgrowing the circumstances that forced it. It began as an answer to one specific crisis, the collapse of the insurance arrangement in a single burning district on a single night. But the principle it established did not stay confined to that. Once a city has accepted that protection from fire is owed to people rather than sold to policyholders, the same logic presses outward into the demand that the protection be competent, that it be adequately funded, that it reach the poor street as surely as the rich one, that it keep pace with the buildings as they rise higher and the dangers as they change. The undertaking made under duress in the 1860s became a standing expectation that each generation since has held its authorities to, and every improvement in the service that followed, every new engine and taller ladder and better method, was in a sense a further payment on a debt first acknowledged in the wake of that fire. The reform was not a single act completed and closed. It was the opening of a duty that has had to be honoured over and over in every decade since by people who mostly never knew where the duty first came from. That, in the end, is what a great disaster can do when it falls on a society ready, however reluctantly, to learn from it. It can turn a catastrophe into a threshold, a night of loss into the beginning of something that saves far more than it cost. Not every disaster does. Many are simply suffered and then repeated, the lesson refused, the same fire lit again a generation later in a slightly different place. What set this one apart was that the cost landed at exactly the point, and with exactly the force needed to break a bad arrangement that everyone had tolerated for too long, and that there were people ready to build something better out of the wreckage rather than merely to rebuild the wreck. And it is worth marking that even then, even with the case made unanswerable and the insurers walking away, the change did not come quickly. The fire burned in June of 1861. The parliamentary inquiry sat the following year. The Act itself was not passed until 1865, and the new public brigade did not formally take over until the first day of 1866. More than 4 years passed between the night the river burned and the morning the city's fire protection was at last a public duty in law and in fact. 4 years is not long in the life of a nation, but it is a reminder that reform grinds slowly even when the argument is settled and the need is plain, and the old system has actually collapsed, because laws must be drafted and debated, authorities established, apparatus valued and transferred, money found and allotted. The wheels turned, but they turned at their own deliberate pace, and in the interval London went on much as before, protected by the tail end of an arrangement everyone now knew to be finished, waiting for the machinery of government to catch up with a conclusion the fire had reached in a single night. There is a lesson in that pace as much as in the reform itself. It tells you that the moment of catastrophe and the moment of change are rarely the same moment, that between the disaster and the remedy there is almost always a stretch of ordinary time in which committees meet and reports are written, and the slow apparatus of a state does its work. The drama is all in the fire, the substance is all in the 4 unglamorous years that followed, the paperwork and the debate, and the patient construction of something that would outlast everyone involved in making it. We remember the flames because flames are memorable, but the thing that actually protected the millions who came after was built afterwards, in rooms with no fire in them at all, by men whose names are even less remembered than Braidwood's, doing the unspectacular work of turning a hard lesson into a durable institution. Those men, the drafters and administrators and members of the board, worked in the certainty that fire would come again, because it always does. That is the quiet, unglamorous premise beneath the whole enterprise. The acceptance that a great city packed with people and timber and, in that age, with open flame in every hearth and lamp and workshop, will burn somewhere, on some scale, more or less constantly, and that the only rational response is not to hope it will not, but to be permanently, professionally ready for when it does. The old insurance arrangement had, in its way, understood this too, but it had answered the certainty of fire with the logic of the ledger, protecting what was profitable to protect. The new arrangement answered the same certainty with a different logic, the logic of duty, protecting what was there to be protected because people lived in it. The fire itself was the same enemy, under both systems. What changed was the spirit in which the city chose to meet it, and meeting it properly meant accepting a permanent cost for a benefit that would, if everything went well, mostly be invisible. A great many nights on which nothing burned and the engines never moved, and the expense seemed, to a certain kind of mind, like money spent on nothing. It takes a particular maturity in a society to keep paying, year after year, for a protection whose success looks like absence, to fund the fire brigade generously in the long stretches when there is no great fire to justify it, on the understanding that the one night it is needed will more than repay every quiet year that came before. Tooley Street was the argument that won that maturity, the demonstration, written in 6 deaths and £2 million, of what the quiet years were insuring against and why the cost of readiness was never really a cost at all, but the cheapest bargain the city ever struck. It was the cheapest bargain because of what the alternative had already shown itself to cost. The city had run the experiment of the other way for the better part of a century, the way in which fire protection was a private good, bought by those who could afford it and priced by those who sold it, and the experiment had produced, at its end, a night in which the greatest concentration of wealth in the world went up in flame that no one had the means to stop, and the men best equipped to stop it died in the attempt, and the companies that had owned the whole arrangement looked at the bill and refused to pay it any longer. That was the true price of doing it the old way. Not the £2 million alone, but the discovery that the old way had a ceiling, a point beyond which it simply failed, and that the failure came not gradually, but all at once, on the worst possible night, at the worst possible place. Set against that, the standing cost of a public brigade, paid steadily and quietly through the untroubled years, was nothing. It was the premium on a policy that actually paid out, held by the whole city at once, that could not be cancelled the morning the loss grew too large. And unlike the old policies, this one carried no exclusions. It did not ask the age of the building or the trade carried on inside it, or the wealth of the family asleep upstairs. It did not lapse if a payment was missed or void itself if a mark had fallen from the wall. It covered, by its nature and its founding principle, everyone within the city's bounds, the merchant in his warehouse and the labourer in his rented room alike, on the single qualification of being a person in a place where fire might come. That universality was the deepest change of all, deeper than the engines or the funding or the name on the door, because it redrew the relationship between the city and the people in it. Before, the city's protection had been something you arranged for yourself, each household or business fending for its own safety through the market. After, it was something the city extended to you, unbidden and unpurchased, as one of the plain conditions of living within it. That is not a small shift in the machinery of government. It is a change in what a city is for. For a city is, at bottom, a great many strangers agreeing to live pressed close together, and the terms of that agreement are written partly in law and partly in the quiet provisions a city makes for the people inside it. The water that runs clean from the tap, the light in the street after dark, the help that comes when it is called for. Each of those provisions marks a moment when the city decided that some danger or some need was no longer to be left to each person to manage alone, but was to be met in common by all for all. The Public Fire Brigade was one of the earliest and clearest of those decisions in London, and Tooley Street was its cause. And in that sense, the fire on the river belongs to a larger story than firefighting alone. It is part of the slow 19th century discovery that a modern city, crowded and complex and combustible, cannot be run as a mere collection of private arrangements, that some things must be held and provided in common, or they will not be adequately provided at all. The people asleep in London tonight are the heirs of that discovery, whether or not a single one of them could name the fire that helped to teach it. They inherit a city that has taken a whole catalogue of old terrors and quietly assumed responsibility for them, so that the individual citizen need not lie awake bargaining with each one alone. The fire that could once have consumed a household in the night, with no one bound to come, is among the oldest of those terrors to have been lifted so long ago and so thoroughly that it has passed almost entirely out of the ordinary imagination. And it was lifted in large part because of what happened on one stretch of the south bank of the Thames on a warm evening in the summer of 1861, when the river caught fire and the man who had built the city's defence against fire died holding the line, and the whole comfortable fiction of how London protected itself finally and forever burned away.